All right, welcome back to TalkTickers Earnings Call Time. And today we're doing a deep dive into TSHA Gene Therapies' recent Q1 2025 update.
Yep, this is the gene therapy company, right? Focused on those rare diseases.
Exactly. They're tackling some really tough conditions, aiming to get at the underlying cause with gene therapy.
And the big picture goal is trying to restore function, potentially even reverse some aspects of these progressive diseases.
So our mission today, as always, is to cut through the noise of the earnings call transcript. We'll pull out the essential info for you, the key results, clinical progress, regulatory stuff, and their cash situation.
Let's get right into it. The call covered Q1 2025, ended March 31st. How did the financials look?
Okay, numbers first. R&D expenses.
Came in at $15.6 million for the quarter.
Which is down compared to last year, right?
Yeah, down about $5.1 million versus Q1 2024. They said that was mainly because a lot of the big manufacturing work, the GMP batch activities, happened last year.
Timing. Makes sense.
Right. There was a bit of an offset from higher headcount costs, hiring more people, but the GMP timing was the main driver for the lower spend this quarter.
Got it. And what about the other side? G&A, general and administrative?
That went up a bit, $8.2 million.
Compared to?
That's up $1.1 million from Q1 last year. Primarily higher compensation, and also sounds like more legal and professional fees.
Okay, so R&D down, G&A up slightly, net loss.
Net loss for the quarter was $21.5 million. Or 0.08 per share.
Which is actually an improvement.
It is, yeah. Better than Q1 2024 when the loss was $24.1 million, or 0.010 cents per share. So moving in the right direction, expense-wise.
Always good to see. Now, the crucial part, cash. How much do they have on hand?
As of March 31st, they reported $116.6 million in cash and cash equivalents.
And the big question, how long did that last them? What's the runway?
Based on their current plans, operating expenses, capital needs, they expect that cash to take them into the fourth quarter of 2026.
Okay, Q4 2026. That gives us a good time frame for their current operations. Thanks for that snapshot.
No problem.
But really, the main event on this call, the driver for the company, is their lead program. That's TSHA for Rett Syndrome.
Right. And maybe we should just briefly explain Rett Syndrome. It's a really devastating rare disease, mostly affects girls.
Yeah, it's neurodevelopmental, progressive, leads to really severe problems with motor skills, communication, autonomic function, seizures, often needs 247 care.
And a key point they always emphasize is this post-regression plateau. Usually around age 5 or 6, patients hit a point where, based on all the natural history data, they just don't gain new functional skills.
So spontaneous improvement basically stops. That's the context. What's TSHA designed to do?
It's a one-time gene therapy. The goal is to deliver a working copy of the MECP2 gene, which is the gene that's faulty in Rett syndrome.
Trying to fix the underlying problem.
Exactly. Restore the MECP2 protein expression across the central nervous system. And the hope is, by doing that, it could actually allow patients, even in that later plateau stage, to gain new functional skills they otherwise wouldn't.
Okay, so a potentially transformative approach. They gave updates on the trials. The REVEAL Phase 12 studies.
They did. There are 2 ongoing trials, one for adolescents and adults, females 12 and up in the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, the other
is pediatric, females aged 5 to 8. That one's running in the U.S., U.K., and Canada.
And Part A, the dose-finding part, that's finished dosing now.
Correct. Part A is complete. They dosed 10 patients in total across the 2 trials. 6 got the high dose, which is 1 E15 vector genomes, or VG.
Yeah, and the other 4?
Got the low dose, 5.71 feed VG.
Okay. Safety first, always critical with gene therapy. What did they say as of the April 10th data cutoff?
Profile continues to look pretty good based on their report. Generally well tolerated across both doses.
Any major issues?
Importantly, no. They reported no treatment-related serious adverse events and no dose-limiting toxicities in any of the 10 patients in Part A.
That's encouraging. Now, the really exciting part, what are they actually seeing in these patients? The clinical observations from Part A?
Yeah, this is where it gets interesting. They talked again about seeing these early clinical improvements and, importantly, functional gains after treatment.
Not just temporary bumps.
No, they emphasize these gains seem to be persisting and even strengthening over time. They specifically mentioned observations in the low-dose group improvements in fine motor skills, gross motor skills, even socialization and communication.
They gave some really concrete examples too, didn't they? Like using eating utensils.
Exactly. Things like starting to use utensils, being able to sit or stand independently when they couldn't before, and even using an eye gaze device to communicate.
And the significance of that, given what you said about the plateau phase.
That's the key point they hammered home. In untreated patients in this post-regression phase, you just don't expect to see these kinds of near functional skills emerge. Natural history says it doesn't happen.
So seeing it happen post-treatment strongly suggests TSHA 102 might actually be having a therapeutic effect, changing the course of the disease.
That's certainly the implication they're drawing, yeah.
Okay, that's a potentially huge clinical signal. Let's connect that to the regulatory side. What was the big news regarding the FDA?
This was probably the headline item from the call. They've been talking intensely with the FDA for about 18 months now.
Using that special pathway, RMAT.
Right. The Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapy designation gives them more frequent interaction, and those talks focused on nailing down the design for a pivotal trial.
A trial designed to really rigorously measure those clinically meaningful functional gains you were talking about.
Precisely. And the news is they've achieved written alignment from the FDA on the key elements of that pivotal Part B trial design.
Written alignment, what does that cover specifically?
Covers the big things. The overall trial design, the primary endpoint they'll use, the patient population, and even the estimated number of patients needed for statistical significance.
Wow, written alignment on all those key parts. What does that mean for the usual regulatory process? Does it change things?
It does, and this is pretty significant. Because they reached this alignment through RMAT, the FDA apparently advised them to skip the formal end-of-phase meeting.
Skip it entirely.
Yeah. Instead, the FDA told them to go straight to submitting the detailed pivotal trial protocol and the statistical analysis plan.
As an amendment to their existing IND.
Exactly. Submit it as an IND amendment, and they plan to do that this quarter.
And submitting that starts the clock.
Yep. Triggers the standard 30-day FDA review clock. The fact the FDA suggested this path implies a pretty high degree of confidence and agreement already exists. It could definitely speed up getting that pivotal study started.
That sounds like a major de-risking event and a potential accelerator. Will we get more details soon? I assume people want to know more about this Part B design.
Yes, very soon. They're planning what they called a wholesome update at the upcoming IRSF Rett Syndrome scientific meeting. That's June 9th to 11th.
What will that update include?
Specifics on the pivotal Part B design they aligned on, their analysis of natural history data, which provides that crucial baseline context, and, of course, more clinical data from Part A, covering both the high and low dose groups.
There's a pretty comprehensive package of information coming.
Looks like it. They mentioned 3 oral presentations related to TSHA 102 at that meeting. One is specifically focused just on the clinical data.
Okay, great. So we've got the financials, the early clinical signs, the huge regulatory alignment step. Let's switch gears to the Q&A. What were the key things analysts were asking about?
Well, one big topic was dose response. How do you figure out if the high dose is actually better than the low dose, especially when Rett syndrome patients can be quite different from each other?
Yeah, that heterogeneity is always a challenge. How did the company answer that?
They talked about looking at it over time, the temporal aspect, like how quickly do gains appear and what's the magnitude of those gains. They also mentioned supportive data from their animal studies.
And their general thinking.
Logically, they feel that getting higher levels of the working MECP2 protein, which the high dose should provide, ought to lead to a better clinical effect, assuming the safety holds up. They seem to view the high dose as the target dose going forward.
Makes sense. Analysts also want to know about the bar for success and what to really focus on in that upcoming IRSF data release.
Right, what should people look for? And they tied it back to what we just discussed. First, the natural history analysis. That's critical because it shows what doesn't happen without treatment. It sets the stage.
Provides the control context.
Exactly. Then the regulatory details they've aligned on the specific endpoint, the trial design, who they'll enroll, how many patients. That gives you the framework for judging the clinical data.
So you look at the Part A clinical data through the lens of that agreed upon pivotal endpoint.
That's the idea. Their goal at IRSF is to give everyone a better sense of the potential probability of success for the pivotal trial and maybe a clearer timeline towards actually filing for approval, a BLA.
Okay. There are also questions about that FDA review process itself, skipping the end-of-phase meeting, using the IND amendment route. Any concerns there?
They seemed pretty confident. Their explanation was, look, the end-of-phase meeting is usually for getting alignment. Since they already have written alignment on the key stuff via RMAT, The FDA basically said the meeting wasn't needed.
Just submit the plan.
Right, just submit the full protocol and stats plan as the amendment. That starts the 30-day review. They felt it was highly unlikely the FDA would have major new comments given they advised this route.
Did they mention any impact from recent FDA staff changes like Peter Marks leaving?
They addressed that, said their review team has been consistent and they didn't see any impact on their program. They actually felt recent comments from leaders like Bin Prasad about using natural history controls in rare disease trials aligned really well with their approach.
Good to hear. What about actually starting the pivotal trial? How ready are the clinical sites?
They painted a picture of a pretty smooth transition. The sites they use for Part A are already up to speed, familiar with the therapy, contracts are done, IRB's approved, staff are trained.
So they can hit the ground running once the IND amendment is cleared?
That's the impression. They also mentioned potentially adding more sites to enroll faster, and that some existing sites might be able to handle multiple patients in parallel.
Okay. What about expanding beyond the U.S.? Any plans for Europe? EMA?
Yeah, that came up. They know there's a big need in Europe and the UK. They actually have a UK site activated already.
Oh, yeah.
And they said they've taken steps so they can interact with the EMA later. But for now, citing capital discipline, the focus is firmly on the US pathway first. Europe would likely come later, possibly with more funding.
Makes sense financially.
Yeah.
And the deal they have with Astellas? The opt-in?
They confirmed the agreement has specific triggers based on submitting a pediatric data package to Astellas. Couldn't comment on any current talks, but said they'll follow the agreement as written.
Right. Biomarkers came up too. Can they actually measure the MECP2 protein levels in patients to see if the therapy worked?
Apparently not easily right now. They explain there isn't really a good way to measure MECP2 levels reliably in, say, spinal fluid or blood. It's tricky because the protein is inside the cell nucleus and turns over fast.
So how do they know it's working biologically?
They basically view the clinical improvements themselves as the effect of biomarkers for now. Seeing those functional gains, improvements in things like sleep or autonomic function, motor skills, often within just 4 to 6 weeks. That's their signal that the therapy is having the intended biological effect.
The proof is in the pudding, essentially.
Kinda, yeah. The functional recovery is the biomarker, in a sense.
What about the timeline for starting Part B dosing? Did they give any more specifics?
Well, it hinges on that 30-day FDA review of the amendment they're submitting this quarter, but they did suggest site activation activities could potentially start as early as this summer.
Wow, that's fast.
And that could mean actual patient dosing might begin in Q4 of this year, 2025, or maybe Q1 of 2026. So, yeah, a potentially very quick ramp up into the pivotal study.
Okay, nearly there. They also talked a bit more about the primary endpoint for Part B and their safety confidence.
Right. For the endpoint, they want something objective, clinically meaningful, really important to patients and families, easy to measure, and focused on those gains or restoration of functional skills.
How will they make sure it's measured objectively?
They plan to use methods like video assessments and blinded reviewers, similar to what they did in Part A, to minimize bias. And they reiterated they don't think a placebo group is needed. They're aiming for a single-arm trial using that strong natural history data as the comparator.
And safety confidence? Still high.
Seems very high. They kept pointing to the data so far, no DLTs, no treatment-related SAEs, even with more patients now dosed at the higher level. They also view the way they deliver it, intrathecal injection, as relatively benign and feel the potential benefits clearly outweigh the risks for these patients.
Okay, I think that covers the main points from the Q&A pretty well. We've hit financials, the clinical story, the huge regulatory step, and the key analyst questions.
Yeah, a lot unpacked there, a clear picture of where they stand after Q1.
All right. Now, before we wrap up, it's time for our regular disclaimer. What we've discussed so far is purely a breakdown of the information presented by TSHA Gene Therapy on their earnings call. It's for informational purposes only.
Absolutely. And what we're about to discuss next is purely a thought experiment, connecting some dots. It is not financial advice in any way, shape, or form.
Definitely not. Okay, with that crystal clear, let's just think about the pieces they laid out.
Yeah.
We heard cash runway into Q4 2026.
Right?
We heard written FDA alignment on the pivotal trial design.
Big one.
And based on that, they might skip the end of phase meeting, submit the IND amendment this quarter, and potentially, start dosing that pivotal Part B study as early as Q4 this year or Q1 next year.
That potential speed is notable.
It really is. And the endpoint they're measuring is based on those functional gains they claim to have seen relatively early in Part A patients.
Okay, so putting those pieces together.
Here's the provocative thought, just something to mull over based only on their statements. Given that cash runway into late 2026 and the potential to start dosing a pivotal trial aiming to show functional gains possibly by early 2026.
Where are you going with this?
Could the market perhaps be underestimating how quickly we might get a meaningful signal from that pivotal Part B, maybe even an early look, well before that cash runway runs out?
Interesting angle. If enrollment is decent, and if those early functional signals from Part A show up again relatively quickly in the Part B patients.
Exactly. Could seeing even preliminary positive trends from the pivotal study, potentially aligning with the Part A data, happen before they absolutely need to tap the markets again based on their current guidance?
And if that happened, hypothetically,
Could that lead to a significant re-rating of the stock? A shift in the perceived probability of success based on actual pivotal data, even if early, happening sooner than may be currently expected. Just connecting the dots on timelines, regulatory path, and cash.
it's a scenario to consider based purely on the elements they discussed on the call. The potential speed of clinical execution versus the financial horizon.
Purely a thought exercise,
Yeah.
as we said. Something for you to think about based on the information presented.
Okay, so let's quickly recap the main takeaways from this TSHA Gene Therapy deep dive. Solid cash into Q4 2026.
Big check mark there. Major regulatory step with written FDA alignment on the pivotal trial.
A potentially faster path to starting that trial via the IND amendment this quarter.
And key data updates coming soon at the IRSF meeting in June. Pivotal design details, natural history context, and more Part A clinical results.
Seems like they laid out a pretty clear plan.
They did. So remember, this has just been our analysis of the earnings call content. It's for your information only.
Please do your own research. Dig into the details yourself. Check out the company's filings and presentations and form your own conclusions.
Absolutely. Until the next deep dive, keep tracking those tickers.